gentlemen, so I would like to say distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, you're very, very welcome to our Tipperary People and Places lecture series. This is the second in the 2022-23 series, and we are delighted to cooperate with the Garda Síochána in hosting their exhibition, but we are especially delighted to welcome back John Reynolds, who is an old friend of Tipperary Studies. He has been with us in the past and has always given us excellent lectures. So on your behalf, a warm welcome to John, who's now going to give us a lecture on the Guards.
Thank you very much, everybody, and it's a huge privilege for me to be here this evening with a very august audience, I think is the best way to put it. We have the Archbishop, we have Chief Superintendent and Superintendent Murphy, my elected representatives, and of course what we call, I suppose, regulars that come to these lectures. And for me as a Garda historian and also as a serving member, it's a unique privilege to be able to give a presentation to you here tonight in our centenary year in this fantastic venue in the exhibition that I kind of put together. And we're really gathered here tonight to commemorate a momentous event in the history of Ireland. Not just our own history, but the history of the country itself. The foundation of the Civic Guard, as we were known originally, later to become on Garda Síochána in 1923. And there are a lot of parallels between ourselves and the state because we come into existence at the same time. And the more research I've done over the last year, when I've been working full-time in the Centenary, the more I realise that the men who founded the state also founded the Guards. And I suppose it gives us a unique place in Irish history and Irish society. But equally to the Free State, however, the Civic Guard had a very difficult beginning and almost did not survive its first few months. There were dramatic changes forced on the fledgling organisation by events that prevailed, including the Civil War. And even though they were forced on the organisation, they ultimately proved to be very positive, and in a lot of ways they made us into what we are today 100 years later. I think it's fair to say that in 2022, our Garda Síochána is a very modern and diverse police service with over 14,000 members. And while we largely continue to operate as an unarmed community-based police service, as we've done for 100 years, that didn't happen by accident. So this evening I was thinking about what to talk about, and I decided to focus on two key events from our history: the actual foundation of the force itself and what's known as the Kildare Mutiny. Now each of those subjects probably deserve a 1-hour lecture on their own because of how important and complex they are, but I'm going to keep it brief and cover just the main points of interest. And of course I wouldn't get away with not focusing on Tipperary specific information. So I'm going to finish the presentation by talking about the policing situation here in Tip in 1922, including the death of Garda Henry Phelan, the first member of Garda Síochána to be murdered in the line of duty. So there are a few organisations that can trace their formation to a specific day, time and place, but we're very, very fortunate we can do exactly that. We know for certain that the Civic Guard, which later became the Garda Síochána, was founded here at the Gresham Hotel during a meeting which took place there on Thursday, February the 9th, 1922 at 7 p.m. in room 85. And we had a commemorative event earlier in this year in the Gresham, and I couldn't get over the fact that it's now known as the Riu Plaza, but it'll always be the Gresham to me, being a dub, but it's now known as the Riu Plaza Gresham. We can be certain of that foundation meeting because of some remarkable letters of invitation to that meeting which have survived. This one was actually handwritten by Michael Collins himself on the 3rd of February 1922, and it's addressed to District Inspector John Kearney of the Royal Irish Constabulary in Boyle, County Roscommon. This next letter is a typed one that was signed by Collins, and it's addressed to District Inspector Patrick Walsh of the RIC in Letterkenny, County Donegal. And we're actually very fortunate to have that actual letter in our collection in the Garda Museum in Dublin Castle, and it's on display. And I'll come back to the reason why Collins was writing to policemen, which might seem a little bit unusual at the face of it, just after the War of Independence had ended. And as you'd expect from Michael Collins, his letters are very short and to the point, and they say that the Irish Provisional Government are setting up a committee for the purpose of drafting a scheme for the organisation of a new police force. Your name has been suggested to the government for membership of the committee. I should be glad to know if you're willing to serve. And I think that the matter-of-fact wording of the Collins letters of invitation hide the enormity of the task that was being taken on. Our predecessors, the Royal Irish Constabulary, which had policed Ireland for over a century, was in the process of being completely disbanded. So the Irish Free State had no police force. And this photograph shows the formal disbandment parade of the RIC in the Phoenix Park Depot in April 1922. A few hundred RIC men were retained to guard certain places like Dublin Castle and the depot, and to administer the huge process of disbanding an organisation with 13,000 men in it, and also to give the Free State a chance to find men to replace them. And I should say that when Collins refers to the Irish Provisional Government of the new Free State, it wasn't a normal government of the type that we would recognise today. And the turmoil of that period, just before the Civil War broke out in 1922, was written about by this man, Minister for Economic Affairs, Kevin O'Higgins. He said that the government is simply 8 young men in City Hall, standing amidst the ruins of one administration, with the foundations of another not yet laid, and with wild men screaming through the keyhole. No police force was functioning, no system of justice operating. The wheels of administration hung idle, barred out of recognition by the clash of rival jurisdictions. So fairly bleak words there, and in reality the government was made up of young men like O'Higgins who had survived the Rising, had survived being interned in Frongoch and other camps all over the UK as prisoners of war, and had survived the War of Independence, and now they were tasked with forming a new country called the Irish Free State, which is obviously an onerous task. But of course the divisions which existed within the country, within the Dáil, within the IRA, over the acceptance of the treaty, that at this stage, February 22, a bitter and divisive civil war seemed almost inevitable. Kevin O'Higgins later became Minister for Justice, but was assassinated in 1927 as he walked to Mass in Booterstown. He was blamed for the executions of up to 80 prisoners, anti-treaty IRA men during the Civil War. And it's a very, very sad part of our history, because some of these were men that he fought with. One of them, he'd been best man at his wedding. But when you study the treaty documents and the detailed discussions that took place between Winston Churchill and Michael Collins, which I did for a book I wrote, you'll actually see that Churchill was told Collins that if you don't make this new country work, if you don't get control of the situation, we will go back in and we will basically burn the country to the ground to get control back. So there was an awful lot riding on the Free State. There was a lot riding on the success of the new police force as well. And it just shows that even though O'Higgins was killed 5 years after the Civil War, it just really illustrates the tragedy and legacy of the Civil War. This next photograph shows Commissioner Owen Duffy amongst the mourners at the funeral. So coming back to the meeting in the Gresham and who attended, well, you could say it's really like a who's who of the independence movement, and some key figures from not only our history but also Irish history were there that night. You had Michael Collins himself, who convened the meeting, wrote the letters of invitation and did attend. Owen O'Duffy, as you can see here in the photograph, and Ned Broy from the G Division, or political wing of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Broy is the detective who famously smuggled Michael Collins in to look at the files of G Division in Great Brunswick Street Police Station, which is now Pearse Street. And Broy later went on to become Garda Commissioner in 1932. Another key figure is this man, General Richard Mulcahy, who actually chaired the meeting and nominated Michael Staines to be the first Commissioner. A veteran of the Rising himself, he was the first Minister for Defence of the Free State and also served as Chief of Staff of the IRA and a General in the Free State Army. And I know that Mulcahy has a strong connection with Tipperary, as he's buried in Littleton, as you can see from the headstone there. Another very important character is Paddy Brennan, a leading figure from the Clare IRA, and I'll come back to him later on in the presentation because he's a very pivotal character in our history. Michael Staines, as you can see on the left, a 1916 veteran from Newport in County Mayo and the son of an RIC man, was nominated by Mulcahy to be the first Commissioner. And I've often been asked why he was chosen. There were several reasons. He'd fought in the Rising alongside Collins. He was elected as the camp commandant in Frongoch by the men himself, and he was very popular with the men. He was seen as being a very good administrator with an impeccable record in the volunteer movement. And during the truce period, he acted as a truce liaison officer between the IRA, say the Provisional Government, and the RIC, who were confined to barracks awaiting disbandment. And obviously there were a lot of tensions on both sides. So Staines was regarded as having, we'd say, rudimentary policing experience and being a very capable and able administrator. I had the privilege recently of, we unveiled a plaque at Michael Staines' home place in Newport. Commissioner Harris unveiled a plaque in front of about 50 members of the Staines family. And actually, Michael Staines' two great-great-grandsons are serving members of the organisation as well. And when you meet relatives and direct descendants, it really shows you that this might be 100 years ago, but in a lot of ways it isn't really that long ago either, when you meet people that have a direct connection. So what became, the Men on the Gresham became known as the Police Organising Committee. And these days we call it a diverse group, because it included members of the Dáil, senior Free State and IRA commanders, but the majority of the men, as you can see here, were from the RIC, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. And obviously the meeting was held in secret because at this stage the RIC hadn't been disbanded, and it was probably still a treasonous offence for an RIC man to meet Michael Collins in the Gresham Hotel. So it was very, very much kept under wraps, you know, for these men to meet up. And as I said earlier on, some of you might be surprised that the majority of men at the meeting were actually serving policemen, but it does make a lot of sense. The IRA their main campaign had been against the RIC for the War of Independence. They were seen as being relatively easy targets. They lived locally, they were Irishmen, their families could be intimidated and boycotted where they lived, as well as the men themselves. So they bore the brunt of the campaign of the IRA, and over 500 of them were killed between 2 years, 1990 to 22. And actually, pro rata, Tipperary had more police deaths than any other county in Ireland at the time, and it was the most dangerous place to be a policeman during the War of Independence was in Tipperary. But Collins realised that he was going to need experienced professional policemen to manage the new force and train his recruits, because they were going to come straight out of the IRA with no policing experience. And while each of the men on the list could merit a lecture in their own right, I want to take a minute to just take out one guy in particular, District Inspector John Kearney, who is one of the more interesting characters in the story. Kearney was born in Ireland and had been a shop assistant before he joined the RIC, and he worked his way up the ranks. He was a head constable in Tralee when Roger Casement was arrested. Now, head constable was a rank above sergeant, and effectively they kind of ran the district on behalf of the superintendent or district inspectors. But he'd worked his way up the ranks. When Casement was brought into Tralee RIC barracks, Kearney was kind of sympathetic with Casement's aspirations. The two men really hit it off quite well. So instead of having Casement put into a cell, Kearney brought him up to his quarters, where he spent the night with Kearney and his family. He had dinner with them. Kearney allowed him to. Casement had been on a submarine for several days when he was landed by the German U-boat. So Kearney allowed Casement to wash and shave and kind of tidy himself up, and he had dinner. And then the two men spent the night chatting about politics and all sorts of things in Kearney's house, because he didn't want to put him into a cell. There was a suggestion that he might have offered that, look, if Casement wanted to escape, he wouldn't really get in his way, but Casement didn't want to do that. The next morning, when Casement was being brought to the train station to go to Dublin, Kearney found that he had left his watch in the house with a note saying Casement wanted Kearney to have his watch as a gesture for being so kind to him. Kearney didn't feel that he could keep it, and he sent it back to him in prison in London when Casement was under trial. And Casement wrote of how kind District Inspector Kearney was to him and what a gentleman he was, and even though they fundamentally disagreed, that you know, he was a man of integrity and was a kind of a very, very decent Irishman, even, as I said, even though they didn't agree with each other, politically speaking. So Casement did send another gift to Kearney, which he did keep at this stage. So moving on to the Police Organising Committee, Kearney was asked to go on the committee by Michael Collins. At that stage, he was a district inspector in Boyle and Roscommon. When Kearney's name was circulated around, though, the Kerry IRA took exception to it, and they alleged that Kearney had mistreated Casement while he was in custody. And the IRA then in Boyle started to intimidate Kearney's family and threatened to burn them out while Kearney was in Dublin. So basically, Kearney's family had to flee Ireland overnight and got the ferry to England, and Kearney himself left the next day because he was under a serious death threat. And he spent the rest of his life in England and never came back home. So even though he did, you could say, as much entitlement to be in this new committee as anyone else, just things and politics turned against him. But it's a very, very sad story. Kearney's two sons died in the Second World War, and several of his children died as well. And I don't think he was ever really credited for how, even though Casement wrote it himself, of how kind Kearney was to him while he was in custody. And I suppose this is the dilemma sometimes policemen had between being Irishmen and wearing the uniform, and the dilemmas that they faced maybe dealing with cases like this. So I should say as well too that when I said that there was no police force in Ireland when the RIC was disbanded, the IRA had set up a rudimentary police force called the Irish Republican Police. The idea was that the IRA would set up their own system of courts and police, so that instead of going to the RIC, you went to the IRA and you said, I'm having a dispute with my neighbour, or about a right of way, or my neighbour stole one of my cattle or whatever, that you would not go to the state. It was to undermine British administration in Ireland. So you had this kind of group called the Republican Police and the Dáil Courts, but Michael Collins wasn't really a big admirer, and he wrote at one stage that when it was suggested that the Republican Police could form the nucleus of the Garda Síochána, he said, I don't want a casual police force without proper training. It's not necessary for me to illustrate this by pointing to the wretched Republican police system and to the awful personnel. So he's not pulling his punches there really. So Collins basically wanted to start from scratch. So the police organising committee on the 9th of February met late into the night and came back the next day, and showing, I suppose, the efficiency and the reason why Collins chose these men. They divided into subcommittees, and each of them took on a particular task, such as recruitment, training, and of course finance would always be a key factor in it. We're very, very fortunate that Deputy Commissioner Patrick Walsh, who had been District Inspector Patrick Walsh in Letterkenny, retained all of his records and his notes from those meetings, and we have those papers in the Garda Museum in Dublin, and as part of our centenary we've been able to digitise those papers for the first time. And when you actually sit down and read them in detail, things jump out at you that certainly took me by surprise, even though I'm almost 40 years looking at policing history in Ireland. And they do show some remarkable little things. For example, these are the handwritten notes of Patrick Walsh, and down here they're talking about what should the title be for the new chief of the Civic Guard. So somebody has written down Chief Commissioner, but it's been crossed out, and so they went with Commissioner instead. So only for that being crossed out, we'd have a Garda Chief Commissioner rather than a Commissioner. Something else of huge importance as well is over here, Garda on Pobal. That's a proposed name for the force, and it's been underlined. So somebody obviously thought that was a really good name or important name. It was never adopted, but it does tie in with something else, which is the first mention by Michael Collins of the new police. On the 5th of March 1922, Collins was giving a speech at Cottage Green, and he said, we want your support for the new police we are forming. It will be a people's guard for the protection of all classes and parties. So from the very beginning, you know, a lot of people are aware of what Michael Steyn said about the moral authority, the service of the people, but it goes back further than what Steyn said in September 22, right back to Collins himself. The idea that the new police force has to be radically different than the old one. It's got to be have the support of the people. But again, for some reason that we may never know, the name was Garda on Pobal was not adopted, so we became the Civic Guard and later on Garda Síochána. The police organising committee proved to be incredibly efficient, and only 12 days after the Gresham meeting, the first recruits arrived at a temporary training depot at the RDS in Balls Bridge, and that was an extraordinary achievement given the challenges that the Free State faced at the time. There is actually a bit of footage of those men training in the RDS, but it's very good if you ever get to see it. It's on the Pat Day Newsreel website. So I said 12 days after the Gresham meeting, the first men turned up at the RDS, and the story of the RDS is very interesting as well, because the depot that we're familiar with, the Garda headquarters now, was still occupied by a good number of RIC men, so that could not be used for Garda training. So the RDS was asked would they oblige and give us a venue for training new recruits for the Civic Guard. My favourite story from this period is that a few weeks into the training, the Commissioner was approached by the good people around the RDS to say that the horse show was going to go ahead, regardless of us being there or not. So they politely asked us to vacate the premises so that the horse show could go ahead. So Civil War or not, and Garda training or not, we got evicted out of the RDS so that the horse show could go ahead. And that's how we ended up in Kildare Barracks in the first place. The Garda register of the first 6,000 members, if anybody is doing family history or wants to check this, in cooperation with UCD Archives, that's now been digitised and it's available to view through the UCD website. And it starts off with Garda number 1, PJ Kerrigan, on the left here, and Garda number 2, Garda Patrick McAvinia. And even the register itself, when you look at the cover, it's Royal Irish Constabulary crossed out and it says Civic Guard. We had absolutely nothing of our own, understandably, because we were being formed overnight and from scratch. And these two men, incidentally, had both been in the RIC for brief periods, so they got promoted to sergeant after about 3 days because they had a little bit of policing experience. So that's the kind of chaotic thing that was going on in the RDS at the time. I should say as well too that obviously the anti-treaty IRA wanted to undermine the Civic Guards. That was really, really important. They felt if the Civic Guard didn't succeed, it would go a long way to meeting their objectives. So the men that were going to the RDS, and how that operated was that the men, Collins wrote to every brigade commander in the IRA and said, send your best men to the RDS for a special job for the chief, which is Michael Collins. And the men didn't really know what they were doing going to Dublin, except that Collins wanted them. So some of them arrived up to find out that they were joining the new police and didn't want to join it and left. Others thought they were joining the army. But equally, the anti-treaty IRA were trying to stop young men going to Dublin to join the Guards. So the advice went out that if you're going to the RDS, don't go from your local train station. Go to another town, another village. Don't tell anybody what you're doing. Don't tell them you're going up to join the Guards, because the anti-treaty IRA might intimidate you, your family, or might even shoot you, which is what had been done with RIC applicants a couple of years earlier. So the tactics stayed exactly the same. But despite that, men turned up by their hundreds at the RDS for training. This is the first known photograph of the Civic Guards, led by Commissioner Michael Staines. It's in April 1922. A man called Frank Lawless, who was a TD and a 1916 veteran, had died in an accident. Michael Staines brought several hundred Civic Guards who were still in training in the RDS at that stage, and you can see here obviously they don't even have uniforms. They were brought to the Pro Cathedral for his funeral, and the newspapers of course thought this was an amazing sight to see the new police force walk on the streets, and they commented that even though they didn't have uniforms, they seemed to be fine men, upstanding men that have come out of the IRA and the volunteer movement. The Gresham itself unfortunately didn't survive either very much longer, because when we were planning our event at the Gresham, I was asked, wouldn't it be great to have it in the room that the meeting took place in? And unfortunately I had to show the powers that be in headquarters. That's what was left of the Gresham when the Civil War broke out in July 1920. So even though we were able to go to the Gresham site, we couldn't go to the regional room, unfortunately. But again, it just illustrates how bad the Civil War was for everybody. So coming on to what's known as the Kildare Mutiny, and it's unfortunate for Commissioner Michael Staines, his time in office was going to be exceptionally challenging. As I said earlier on, political tensions between pro and anti-treaty supporters were now intensifying into an open revolt inside the depot and outside the depot, and in our case it's known as the Civic Guard or the Kildare Mutiny. By May 1922, thousands of young Garda recruits were in training in the barracks. About 97% of the men had been recruited from the IRA, which was now splitting into pro and anti-treaty factions. And one thing that often surprises people when I've said it this year at different events is that at that stage the Guards were armed, because there is this perception that we've always been unarmed from day one, and it's something that we value. Obviously we value it very highly today, and it makes us one, kind of almost unique amongst police services now. But at that stage, it was intended that the Civic Guard would carry firearms and every guard would carry a revolver. And that was pretty self-evident because the Civil War was going on while the men were going to be sent to their stations for the first time. So on the 15th of May, during the morning parade, when Commissioner Staines was addressing the men, 1,000 recruits suddenly broke out of the ranks while the Commissioner was speaking to them, and representatives of the men presented the Commissioner with a letter, which in reality was an ultimatum. And quite remarkably, it demanded the immediate expulsion from the Civic Guard of 5 senior officers that were named, including this man, Deputy Commissioner Walsh, that I mentioned earlier, and Superintendents Jeremiah Marr, Edmund Prendeville, James Brennan and Bernard O'Connor. And I suppose any of us that have gone through Templemore, the idea that you would walk off the parade ground and hand the Commissioner a letter with your demands on it is something I certainly can't comprehend, but those were the times that pertained to them. And the reason behind the extraordinary demand was that all 5 men, including Walsh, had previously been members of the RIC, but had now been appointed as senior officers in the Civic Guard on appointment. So somebody might have been a sergeant in the RIC and they were now in Kildare Depot wearing the uniform of the chief superintendent. And as you can, I suppose, understand, the post-treaty split had deepened hostility towards ex-RIC men, no matter what the contribution to the cause might have been during the War of Independence. It should be pointed out as well that these men had been handpicked by Michael Collins to serve in the Civic Guard, and in fact, Deputy Commissioner Walsh was a cousin of Owen O'Duffy, from Monaghan. So these men, a lot of them had a pedigree. As I said, Ned Bry had actually spied for Michael Collins and provided information to him. But the rebellious recruits still demanded that those 5 men in particular were dismissed. And I mentioned earlier on this man, Assistant Commissioner Paddy Brennan, TD. And as we know from Irish history, geography and politics are always a factor in these events. Many of the recruits came from Clare, and they were recruited in huge numbers because Paddy Brennan was appointed as Depot Commandant. And it seems that Paddy basically rang Ennis and said, any Clare man with 2 legs that was in the IRA, get yourself up to Kildare and you can join the Guards. So you ended up with a situation that of the 2,000 men in Kildare, maybe 900 came from Clare. There might be 2 guys from Leitrim and 5 from Galway. And those men viewed Paddy Brennan as being their man because he'd fought during the War of Independence. So the recruits actually told the commissioner that they had decided to elect Paddy Brennan to be the new commissioner, and basically he should leave Kildare Barracks, and they had appointed him as the new commissioner. They also raided the armoury as well, which is where it got really dangerous, because when the British were withdrawing, they did leave their weapons behind them for use of the Civic Guard. So there was a fully stocked armoury in Kildare Barracks, and the men raided the armoury and were walking around Kildare Barracks carrying firearms. And so Commissioner Staines basically was forced to leave, under serious threat and under armed protection, and then evacuated the barracks. Now, as you can imagine, when news of events got back to Michael Collins, he wasn't best pleased, to say the least. And the next day, Michael Staines wrote to the government saying, I beg to tender my resignation as Commissioner of the Civic Guard. I do so with great regret, but in the circumstances which have arisen, I can see no other honourable course of action. I entertained high hopes of the future of the Civic Guard, and I regret that this revolt against authority should have been instigated or encouraged. So this is an extraordinary document, the resignation letter of Commissioner Staines to the government. Deputy Commissioner Walsh, one of the 5 men named, and a man of integrity and ability, huge ability, also tendered his resignation, but neither were accepted by the government at that stage. And the situation became so serious that Collins went to Kildare himself on the 26th of May to speak to the recruits. And I only found this out recently because it was buried in these documents of Patrick Walsh, which have only been digitised this year. So we're really finding out a huge amount of new information because of the Centenary celebrations, which is a wonderful thing for us in policing or in history. And this is believed to be the only time that Collins ever spoke to a group of Civic Guards directly to outline what he expected of them. And, the honour of the Civic Guard is in the keeping of each individual member of the force, and the country expects much of you. You will be their guardians, and you will have one great advantage over any previous police force in Ireland. You will start off with the goodwill of the people and their moral support in carrying out your duties. Your authority will be derived from the people, and in all of your relations with them, bear these facts in mind. Earn the respect and confidence of the people. And I think that for any of us that have done this job and wear this uniform, those words are inspirational even a century later. And it just shows what I said earlier, that from the very, very beginning, the influence of Collins on the Guards hasn't really been recognised until now. And it just shows you that this idea of the moral authority and servants of the people was embedded from the very beginning, where Collins wanted to make the Guards, I suppose, the exact opposite of what the RIC had ended up becoming because of the War of Independence. So for almost several weeks, there were stalemate as Collins, Staines and the rebels attempted to reconcile their differences as civil war drew ever closer. But both sides were unaware that their efforts to resolve the dispute were being thwarted by a group of anti-treaty Civic Guards who wanted to destroy the force from within, as well as anti-treaty IRA members known as irregulars from outside the depot. The most serious incident took place on the 18th of June when an armoured car like this one was used by irregulars or anti-treaty forces to gain access to the Kildare depot using a password leaked by a Civic Guard, and they took a huge amount of weapons from the armoury. The weapons were then brought to the Four Courts garrison, and only 10 days later the tragedy of the Civil War began when the government ordered the Free State Army to begin shelling the Four Courts. This period also saw the tragic death of 21-year-old recruit Garda Liddy from County Leitrim. On the 20th of June, he was accidentally shot dead by his cousin and fellow recruit Michael McKenna after he had been socialising in a pub in Kildare with a number of other recruits while carrying firearms. On learning of this death, Commissioner Staines wrote to the Minister saying, "This tragic incident is a striking illustration of the state of indiscipline which exists in the Civic Guards, since its members, encouraged by those who might know better, went into open revolt and repudiated all authority." So the mutiny urgently needed to come to an end, as the Civic Guard itself, as an organisation, was now in jeopardy, even though it was only 6 months old. Collins authorised a commission of inquiry into the Kildare mutiny, and this is the original document signed by Collins. Again, we have this in the Garda Museum in Dublin Castle. He authorised the commission to be carried out by Barrister Kevin O'Shiel and civil servant Michael McAuliffe. The commission would examine the grievances of the Kildare recruits, and I think, in a martial stroke typical of Collins, he realised that the recruits hadn't been paid for several weeks, and he arranged that the back pay was paid immediately. And those actions had a key effect in diffusing tensions in the Kildare depot, because for the previous almost 2 months, no training had been going on, and you had a couple of thousand men wandering around Kildare armed and deciding what side they were going to take, and it was an extremely dangerous environment. Assistant Commissioner Brennan resigned from Garda Síochána shortly afterwards and rejoined the Free State to serve with his brother General Michael Brennan. And this is one of the most extraordinary photographs we found in the Garda archives as part of this process. Now, I've been to many retirement functions over the years, but I never saw anybody getting a car as a retirement gift. So just no pressure there now, Superintendent, when your time comes. But the recruits who supported Paddy Brennan banded together to buy him a Wolseley motor car, which is quite an extraordinary, and that's him sitting in it just as he was leaving the depot. And I think this is a signal that, well, Paddy Brennan might be leaving the Guard, but he's still kind of our man. And again, it's quite extraordinary, especially that he only got 6 months service. He hadn't even done 30 years. But again, it's just one of those wonderful little snapshots. So coming back to the recommendations of the Commission of Inquiry, and obviously these are really urgent because the Civil War at this stage had already started in July, and we're now into August 22. The changes recommended by the Commission were seismic for an organisation that had only existed for a few months, but those recommendations laid the foundation for the police service that the Civic Guard became and largely define us today, 100 years later on. The Commission said that it had been a fundamental mistake to arm the Guards at the beginning. They felt it would not reassure the public that the day of the militaristic and coercive policeman was at an end in Ireland. And of course, we were coming out of 3 years of having, you know, the heavily armed RIC, plus the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, and the British Army as well. And from then on, the Civic Guard would operate as a largely unarmed police service, as we still do today. The Commission also recommended that Michael Staines should resign, not because he wasn't a good commissioner, but because he was serving TD. And that was one of the reasons why there were such tensions in Kildare, because Paddy Brennan was a TD, and so was Michael Staines. And the Commission said that no elected representative should ever have been appointed to any position whatsoever within the ranks of the Civic Guard. And of course, I suppose at the time it seemed like a good option that Staines was regarded as a safe pair of hands. But that separation of politics and policing came in at that stage. And I think it was up until the 1950s, guards weren't actually allowed to vote at all as serving members. And even today, you cannot be in a political party if you're a serving member of Garda Síochána. So there is that desire to separate policing from politics. And above all, the Commission of Inquiry recommended that the Civic Guard must be sent out on duty throughout Ireland as soon as possible. That sitting around the depot really wasn't getting anybody anywhere, that these men needed to be out in the streets. And it was a very, very difficult balancing act because the Civil War was going on at the time. But on the 17th of August 1922 at precisely 1:30 p.m, Commissioner Michael Staines and Chief Superintendent Matthias McCarthy led a march of 440 Civic Guards along Dame Street and through the Palace Street Gate into the lower yard of Dublin Castle. This is Commissioner Staines here. He never wore a uniform during his tenure, and Matthias McCarthy beside him had been an RIC sergeant in Belfast until he went to the Gresham meeting. This is one of the last acts of Michael Staines as Garda Commissioner. And while they came in the front gate at the rear in Ship Street, the last remaining members of the RIC in Ireland were packing up their belongings into what they called barrack boxes, these wooden boxes that had your name on it. And they're basically loading up their possessions. And then when it was all over, they threw the uniforms on the ground and left through the Ship Street gate quietly. And that really was the last of the RIC. And this extraordinary photograph I found it recently on the RT archives. This is a young girl who's wearing one of the dreaded auxiliaries, Balmorals, that they wore when they were driving around Ireland terrorising people. And you see all the uniforms just thrown on the ground there while the last belongings are being loaded in. So it just illustrates the seismic change in Ireland, that the last of the RIC were departing. And as we came in the front gate, it symbolised that the Civic Guards would soon start to arrive throughout Ireland, because this is the first time that the Guards had appeared in uniform anywhere. And they only had 60 uniforms to put on, so they took the kind of, I suppose, the finest looking men and put them at the front, and everybody else was at the back not wearing uniform, because they only had 60 uniforms. We wanted to recreate that occasion, so on the 27th of August this year, we had our largest event of the Centenary year, and over 500 Gardaí from all over the country assembled at the Gresham Hotel, because obviously that's where it all began for us, and marched to Dublin Castle. And for serving members who attended the event, as well as retirees and families of deceased members, it was an incredibly proud moment to march through the Palace Street gates, just as our predecessors had done in 1922. And we went to a lot of trouble to recreate that photograph when the Commissioner led the officer corps into the gate of the castle. And it was a remarkable occasion. We then marched from the lower yard to the upper yard for a special commemorative event, and it was a day that any of us that took part in it will never forget. So coming down towards the end of the presentation now, on the 20th of August 1922, Michael Collins began a tour on Civil War battlegrounds in Munster. He stopped in Limerick, where General Owen O'Duffy, who was still in the Free State Army at that stage, had recaptured the city after some of the worst fighting of the Civil War to date. That night, Collins stayed in a hotel in Cork, and he wrote a letter to President Cosgrave back in Dublin, and emphasising the importance of getting the new police out of training in Kildare and out on duty amongst the people. Collins wrote, "It would be a big thing to get the Civic Guards both here in Cork and in Limerick. Civil administration is urgent everywhere in the south, but the people are splendid." And this shows that despite the enormous pressure that Collins was under running the Civil War, bringing normal civil policing to the new Irish Free State was a top priority for him. But unfortunately, only 2 days later, on the 22nd of August, Michael Collins himself was killed at Bail of Law. By coincidence, the very same day as Collins died, the resignation letter of Commissioner Staines was finally accepted by the Provisional Government, who wrote to him saying that it was accepted with huge regret and that the government greatly appreciated his service. And as I said, Michael Staines was required to resign because he was a serving TD, but it was no reflection on him or his ability as a commissioner. And he didn't really want to be appointed in the first place. He made it quite clear when he was appointed that it was only to be temporary. But his final act before resigning as Commissioner and General Owen O'Duffy assumed command was to issue a 3-page open letter to Civic Guards before they left Kildare for the new stations. And it was a very daunting prospect for these young men, going out in the midst of a civil war, not now carrying firearms, and wondering how they were going to be received by the people. So Staines wrote that you are the pioneers of a new force, and the body will be judged by the few. You will become objects of interest and criticism, friendly and otherwise, and you must discharge your duties towards the general public, as will earn for you the respect, goodwill and confidence of the people. And they're the words I suppose we try and live by today as a unarmed community-based police service. So in September 1922, having completed their training, the first recruits were sent to Garda stations all over Ireland. The Civil War was taking place, and policing the Free State was both difficult and dangerous for an unarmed force. And in some places, the Guards couldn't arrive until very, very late in 22, and they didn't get into Mayo until January 23 because the Civil War was at its height down there. Because of the very dangerous situation in Tipperary, the first party of Civic Guard didn't arrive in Thurles until early November. And this is a map that just to show how dangerous Tipperary had been during the War of Independence. These are the 46 policemen that were killed in the 2 years of the War of Independence. That's what I wrote a book about there several years ago. Just shows you that, like all over the county, you know, every crossroads and village that you go through, there's some connection with the War of Independence. So Tipperary, as I said, pro rata was the most dangerous county in Ireland for policemen during the War of Independence. And it was pretty dangerous during the Civil War as well. The first reference to the Guards arriving into Thurles was in the Nationalist newspaper on the 6th of November. Now, the Guards had arrived in other places as early as September, but it wasn't safe to come into Thurles or Tipperary until November the 6th. And they occupied the old RIC barracks. Now, there is some discussion, and I was talking to Timbo earlier, where the barracks was at the time. The newspaper just says they occupied the old barracks, but there was a barracks in Friar Street, but there is some mention that there had been another barracks in town as well, further down the town near the Ursulines. And equally important as well, to show our independence, the first court started to operate then again in November. This is the 21st, and it just shows you that the first district court of the new free state, because up until then they had been magistrates' courts and not district courts, took place on the 21st of November 1922. This is the first reference to the list of stations, which is early in 1923, because Commissioner O'Duffy was requiring, we call them returns. How many stations have we occupied? What's the situation like in your county? Because the Civil War was still raging at this stage. And it just shows you some of the stations we have here. Thurles had Barracks, Clonakilty, Devey, Drumban, Holy Cross, Cooley, Littleton, Moyne. And then when you look at other places too, a lot of them are long gone, those stations. But you can see Thurles had 2 sergeants and 12 guards. So the numbers are quite low at the time, because men were being trained and sent all over the country, and it took a while to build up to get the numbers into the counties and to the districts. And Tipperary, again, as I said, was dangerous, because the first guard to be murdered was Garda Henry Phelan, registered number 1347. And as the chief said earlier on, we were in Mullaghone yesterday commemorating the death of Henry Phelan, 100 years to the day since he was killed. Henry was stationed in Callan, and Callan was kind of on the border of Kilkenny and Tipperary counties. Henry travelled in to buy some hurleys and slitters, because he was trying to set up a hurling team back in Callan. And unfortunately, he engaged, well, the anti-treaty IRA engaged him, and Henry was shot dead inside a shop there, a pub shop on the main street in Mullaghone. And he was the first guard to be murdered in the line of duty. Henry was 22, he'd been born on Christmas Day 1900, and ironically, he'd been a member of the Volunteers up in Laois, where he came from. And so he was no different really to the man that killed him, that volunteer background, but he chose to join the Civic Guards and, I suppose, take part and support the treaty, and he paid the price for it. Henry's remembered on our Roll of Honour, which is up in the Dublin Garden and Dublin Castle. It's a wonderful spot here. We have 89 names engraved on the walls here of all 89 Gardaí that have been murdered in the line of duty since 1922. And every May we have a ceremony of remembrance with the families of those men, to remember them and their sacrifice. So just coming into conclusion then, I suppose, the 25 men who gathered in the Gresham Hotel on the 9th of February, I was wondering during the year, what would they think now if they saw us today, and 100 years later on, would they be proud of what they had achieved? You know, just after one war had ended and another was about to begin, a very unlikely combination of policemen, IRA volunteers and TDs really put aside their differences as sworn enemies 6 months earlier, and they came together to found a new police force for a new country. Within a short time, when Garda Síochána had been accepted into communities they policed, creating a unique relationship with the people of Ireland that remains today and is the envy of other police services who visit. And anybody who's ever worked in the Garda College, and where we would meet a lot of visiting police, that's one thing we're always asked, because our approval rating is very high. We have this reputation for community policing, and we get police from all over the world saying, how do you do it? What's the secret of community policing in Ireland? And I suppose our answer always is, well, we've always done it. And it goes back to the way that we were founded, an unarmed community-based police service rather than a police force. And for me as a serving member and a historian as well, to know that the organisation was actually founded by such an iconic figure as Michael Collins and the other men like Mulcahy and the rest, it's something we can justifiably be proud of as we enter the final part of our centenary year. And just a couple of projects I've been working on over the last while, which have actually been done and finished. One of them is a thing we're very proud of, a book called The Guardians. It's not a heavy history book, but it's about 40 different illustrations of different types of policing, you know, the first women in the job, UN service, cybercrime, stuff like that. And it's actually been nominated for a Book of the Year award. It's going to be televised on the 23rd of November. I was on the editorial board, and I also contributed a chapter about the history of the Garda College. One other thing as well, if you saw earlier on, the historic photo archives. And this is a fantastic thing to get up and running. We have over 20,000 photographs in our historic collection. Some of them were left behind when the RIC left, believe it or not. These huge glass negatives showing RIC men back in the 1900s. They've all been digitised now by our technical bureau, our photographic section, as a kind of labour of love. It's taken over 20 years, and they provide an absolutely unique insight into Irish life over the last 100 years. And again, you can see them all around the walls here, and I specifically chose Tipperary crime scenes for this exhibition here. The director of the National Library, the National Photographic Archive in Dublin, who launched the collection in July, said that while she has 5 million photographs in the collection, she thinks the release of the Garda photographs is one of the most significant contributions to Irish history in the last couple of decades. So that's a fantastic thing to have up and running. We have about 700 photographs on the site at the moment, and I'm adding new ones every month as we get them digitised and uploaded. And then just to go through some of the crime scenes that we have, and we are very conscious as an editorial board. We did consider I suppose the ethics and the kind of tastefulness of putting these photographs online. So they've been very, very carefully selected and curated to not cause offence to people. And anything that's distasteful has been removed because the photographs show the crime scene itself. But we have taken out any of those distressing images. But it gives you an incredible snapshot of what life was like in Ireland back in these times. This is Nina 1936, the case of a murder, a field out the town. Again, even how people lived back then. That's another crime scene in 1943. You'd be glad to know, I couldn't find any for tourists, so it must be a very quiet district going back over the years. This is a recent tragedy in Nina Garda station in 1944, where one guard actually murdered another one and then took his own life. And it's never really been explained what happened there. There was no row between them. Nobody seems to know what happened. It's a huge tragedy. But again, these men were living in barracks 24/7. I'm sure there were tensions and disagreements, and sometimes they boiled over. But again, even to see the buildings that's the public office of the Garda Station 44. And these are the two books, which I'd be very remiss of me not to promote my own books when I'm finishing up the lecture here. So I'm happy to leave it at that, folks. Again, I'm not sure if anyone wants to ask any questions. I'm happy to take them if anyone wants to. But otherwise, thank you so much for your time and attention this evening.